Hi, everybody. Welcome to this talk. I know there's a lot of good stuff going on right now, so I appreciate you coming here to spend some time with me. And let's get right into it, and let's look at some code. This is an interesting setup here because I can easily get into a setup where I can neither see my laptop nor the screen, so we're just sort of going to be flying on instruments. It's going to be great, I promise. So they often tell speakers to open with a joke. And so I am opening with the only piece of Ruby code that has ever brought a room of Ruby trainees that I have been training to actually break out in laughter upon seeing it. We'll see whether it works here or whether you just kind of had to be there. So here it goes. This is, yeah, I guess you had to be there. This is, does anybody know? This is from the Rails active support codebase. This is a class called String Inquirer. And this is the vital, we're starting with the key core pieces of Rails, the Rails infrastructure here. This is the piece of the Rails framework that allows you to type rails.env.production ? Instead of rails.env == production. So a core feature. It is, as they say, as Eileen said this morning, it is Rails magic. And what we're going to be doing here is we are going to be looking behind the scenes at some pieces of this Rails magic. And we're going to discover the secret that Eileen alluded to this morning, that it is all Ruby when you go look at it. So this is Rails on Ruby, how Ruby makes Rails great. I'm Noel Rappin. I work for Chime Financial. There's about 10 of us floating around here. There's a couple people here. Chime people raise hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. We'd love to talk about Chime engineering. Come hit us up. You can find me online in a couple of places. I promised myself I would only get self-promotional at the end. That's my incentive for getting through the talk quickly and not wasting more of your time. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about 5 tricks in the Rails code base, 5 different ones. And we're not going to explain all of the Rails internals because it's only a 40-minute talk. And so I've kind of biased towards examples that are easy to explain in a single slide. But I'm also not going to be defensive about Rails design. Like Eileen this morning, although some of these metaprogramming techniques within Rails have trade-offs, I'm really happy that they're there. I like them. I think they make the Rails framework easier to use and easier to work with. And we will talk about the trade-offs, but we're coming at this from a perspective that these techniques are worth the trade-off, and that is part of what makes Rails special and easy to use. So, Act 1 is String Inquirer. Here's the code again. String Inquirer is a subclass of string, which means that it inherits all of string's functionality, which in practice means it's 200 some odd instance methods and its instance variable, which is essentially the value of the string. And then it adds 2 methods to it. It adds respond to missing, and it adds method missing. Method missing is an important piece of core Ruby here. Most of the things that we're going to be talking about here are core features of Ruby, Ruby objects, all Ruby objects. Method missing is the Ruby method lookup of last resort. As Ruby, if you send a method to an object in Ruby, Ruby looks for that method definition in that class, and then in all of the various superclasses and included methods and so on, all the way up to object through basic object. And if Ruby doesn't find any matching methods, Ruby does the exact same search, starting back at the object level, looking for a method called method missing. And if it finds one, it invokes it, and it invokes it with the method name as the first argument, and then all of the rest of the arguments as dynamic arguments behind it. And what this allows you to do is dynamically choose to do something in response to this method call, usually based on parsing the method name. So in this particular case, you see here that it does a check on the method name, and if that check is true, it does something else. If the check is false, it returns super. In this case, I'll talk about that in a couple slides. I do want to point out though, that Rails used to use this very, very heavily for active record finders. You don't see it as much anymore, but Rails used to allow you to dynamically build up active record finder methods. So you could write find all by name and email and country and whatever, and Rails would use this sort of method missing thing to parse the name and create the finder, the SQL code that you were expecting. It doesn't do that anymore. Once Ruby added keyword arguments, the keyword arguments turned out to be just as readable and a lot less dynamic, a lot sort of easier to manage. But Rails has a long history of using method missing and this kind of dynamic parsing of method names at runtime to do functionality. And we'll actually see some other examples of that today as well. Specifically, what this method is doing is it is looking at the method name, and it is using string. If the method name coming in as a string ends in a question mark, so that's you're using the end with method, it is comparing the method name on the right side. The method name substring there is the entire string, the entire method name minus the last character, so this the method name minus the question mark, and it's comparing it to self, which is the value of the string. So if you call ruby.env.production question mark, it pulls off that question mark and compares the value of the string against the string production. If that's true, it returns true. If it is false, it returns false. If the method name does not end in a question mark, we go down the else branch. We call super. It continues searching for method missing in string or whatever. Most likely it doesn't find it, and you most likely get a method not found exception. So this is really interesting. It allows you to dynamically have a method name that checks the value of the string for all string values that are that can be turned into Ruby method names, so nothing with a space. And I guess if your string is named empty, you're in trouble because there's already an empty question mark in Ruby string. But for these purposes, it's a dynamic way to have this kind of a lookup here that looks like a method rather than like an equality test. Okay. The string inquirer also implements respond to missing. And the idea here is to enable a Ruby check using the respond to question mark method to behave consistently. So the idea here is that the respond to missing will return true in a case where method missing will handle this method name, and false otherwise, so that when you use the respond to question mark method, it behaves consistently even if you're doing something dynamic with the method name. So whenever you implement method missing, you should implement a parallel respond to missing so that they're consistent. And in this case, often you'll have a separate method that implements the logic for both. In this case, the logic for both is really simple. It just doesn't end with a question mark. So it's fine to have it's implemented in both places. So why? Why would you do this? Why would you create this weird metaprogram thing just to avoid typing equals equals and save a couple of keystrokes? And I specifically saw somebody on Mastodon just a couple of weeks ago complaining about this very feature of Ruby, of Rails. And I want to suggest a reason. So you can imagine a few different ways that this thing could be designed. I have an environment. I want to be able to query the environment. So there's the thing that we're doing here with string inquire. You could do nothing and use equality. You could create some sort of environment object that explicitly defines production question mark, test question mark, development question mark against whatever the actual environment is. So there's a few different ways to do this. And I want to say that even in this sort of small design decision, there is an advantage to using this sort of metaprogramming thing in that the metaprogramming solution, unlike those other couple that I mentioned, has two positive features. One of which is it is immediately flexible against new environments. So if you have an environment that you're calling QA, or if you have an environment that you're calling staging, or whatever, this technique just works. You don't have to tell Rails that you have a weirdly named environment. It just works, unlike for example, an explicit object. It also, and I think a little bit more subtly, encapsulates knowledge of the internals. You don't need to care whether the name of the environment is stored as a string or a symbol. And that may seem minor, but if you are doing it as an equality, if you had rails.env equals symbol production instead of string production, that would never be true, because it would always be string production. And I could easily imagine a case where that could get through a code review and go into production, and you would expect production behavior to happen that would never actually happen. So we're preventing, I mean, it may sound like a stretch, but it actually sounds kind of plausible to me that a team could mess this up or that you would spend some time tracking it down. So for whatever sort of weirdness about these methods not being defined explicitly, you do have these benefits of this dynamism against this flexibility against your own environment needs and this encapsulation against the actual internals of the way that this is stored, even for this very small design decision. And we'll talk about some of the negatives of all of these techniques at the end. Okay, so that's the first act. That's the first piece of code we're going to look at. The second piece of code I want to call your attention to is view assignment. A core feature of Rails, basically from day one, is that instance variables that are defined in a controller method are passed through and are accessible as instance variables in the view. Often you go several years as Rails developers before wondering how this actually happens because they are two different objects, or you don't think about them being two different objects, and then you learn they're two different objects and you wonder why it happens. So here's the code. Here's some of the code that we're going to look at. We're not going to go through the whole response sequence that's very long and has a lot of details that we don't care about. But here's a piece of code. This is from the controller path. This is part of either active controller or the abstract controller at the top. So it's defined for all controllers. And this is the method name here is viewAssigns, and it's doing a few different things. First off, at the top here, it is calling a Ruby core method called instance variables, which returns a list of all the instance variables that an object has already defined as a list of strings with the @ sign in front of all of the strings. So you see an example there at the bottom. We then subtract out this protected IVARs, which is Rails has some controller instance variables that are so private that it doesn't want to pass them onto the view. So it just sort of pulls them. It subtracts them out of the array up top. They don't get passed to the view. And then we call this method each with object. Each with object is a method of Ruby's enumerable module. It is passed to a collection. It takes an argument and a block. The argument is some sort of accumulator, some sort of collection object, usually an empty hash or an empty array. The block takes two arguments, one of which is each element of the original collection in turn, and the other of which is that accumulator object. Inside the block, the intention is that you will modify the accumulator object, and then the accumulator object will be returned at the end. So what this is doing inside the block, we have an assignment statement. The left-hand side of the assignment statement is the hash. We are specifying a key in the hash. It's the name, which is it's from that same list, so it's the name of all of those instance variables with the @ sign attached. So slice there is probably the most verbose way in Ruby to say take the first character off of this string. So we just have the name without the @ variable. And then on the right side, we're using a core Ruby method called instance variable get. Instance variable get takes the string name of an instance variable with the @ sign attached and returns the value of the instance variable. You have probably been told that instance variables in Ruby are private. Nothing in Ruby is actually private. And instance variables are retrievable and settable through instance variable get. And we'll see in a second, it's through instance variable set. So this method converts all of the instance variables of an object to a hash. And the keys of that hash are the names of the instance variables with the @ signs removed. They're actually strings. I have it as a symbol here. It's actually a string. And the values are the value of those instance variables. And this method, this value gets sort of packaged up, and in the fullness of time, it is passed along to the view. And on the other side of the view, we have this method called assign, which takes in this same hash as its argument and goes through in each loop with that hash. And that loop does the exact opposite. For every element in there, it takes a key and a value, and it calls instance variable set. The first argument to that is the name. We have reinstated the @ sign. Instance variable set takes the string with the @ sign, and then the value of it. So this is what Ruby does. It packages up all of the controller variables into a hash, and then it passes that hash along to the view, which unrolls it and puts it in as instance variables on the view side. I'm not entirely sure why it strips the @ symbol only to reinstate the @ symbol. It seems like you wouldn't have to do that. but there may be some other thing in the path that depends on the @ symbol not being there. I don't know, but that's what it does. And I think that I've always felt that this convention of Rails has always been sort of critiqued for lack of encapsulation. You can imagine other mechanisms where the controller method returned a value that you passed along to the view, or where you had like a known object or a known API to pass values to the view. Rails does neither of those things. Rails instead does this instance variable thing. And what I think is this instance variable thing, and like a couple of techniques we're going to talk about here, is like very easy to use and explain at variables in the controller become at variables in the view, as long as you don't think about it too much and try and understand what it's doing. And I think that Eileen alluded to this this morning, that there's sort of an aesthetic sense in Rails that Rails will take on a bunch of complexity so that you don't have to think about it. And here's a case of it. We have sort of the simplest possible API for passing variables from the controller to the view, and it's backed up by this sort of, a little bit arcane piece of Ruby metaprogramming to make it work. That's Act 2. How's it going so far? Good? Yeah, 2, 1, 2. Yeah, okay, good. Just checking in, making sure you're all there. Act 3, the third thing of the 5 we're going to talk about callbacks. I actually had no idea how these were implemented when I went into this talk, and it turns out to be very interesting. It turns out there's basically an active support module that could almost be a gem in its own right that you can use to create callbacks in your own application. And let me show you how it works. This is, and I apologize if this is a little bit small. I honestly can't tell from here whether it's small or not, so, and it's an image, so I can't increase the size. So I apologize. This is from the controller. This is from abstract controller. It is creating the before action, after action, and around action methods that you then use in your controller. So what this is doing on the first line, we have an array of 3 symbols, before, after, and around, and then there's a block. And inside that block, we're calling a core Ruby method called define method, which we're calling 3 times to define 3 different methods, and then an alias method, which we're not going to worry about as much. Define method here, let's take a look at one of those in a little bit more detail. Define method here is taking, define method is again another piece of core Ruby. It defines a method dynamically at runtime. It takes one argument typically, which is the name of the new method. This is typically generated dynamically at runtime. As you can see here, the name of the method is being created dynamically with string interpolation. It's before action, after action, or around action. And then it takes a block. And that block becomes the body of the method. The arguments to the block are the arguments that the method expects when the method is called. So what's actually happening here is we're actually creating the methods for before action, around action, after action that are being used. What's happening in here is not like super important for our purposes, except that it's calling this like set callback method, and you see that takes a symbol, process action. It takes the name of the callback before, after, or around. It takes the name of the method and whatever that you're calling back. And this is essentially the Rails callback module doing some bookkeeping to keep track of the callbacks that are defined and the blocks that are associated with them, or the things that are associated with them to execute. And in the sort of fullness of time, the controller calls process action, which runs all these callbacks. So run callback is part of the active support API here. It takes in a symbol, process action. You'll note that was the same symbol that we defined, that we set all of these things to. So what this run callbacks method says is like, you have potentially defined a bunch of callbacks that are attached to process action, run them all. And what that looks like here, this is part of the code that doesn't have the around bits because those are more complicated. But you can see here, and I'm going to hand wave this a little bit, you can see invoke before, which means it is invoking all of the before callbacks. If it has not gotten some sort of halted signal, it runs the actual block, the actual action, and holds on to that value, and then it runs any of the after callbacks, and then it returns the value. And this is a very general mechanism. If you have some kind of workflow in your Rails application that is calling a bunch of psychic workers or whatever, and you wanted to have hooks to go into it, you wanted to define hooks that worked like Rails hooks, you actually can use this relatively straightforwardly to say, like, this is an action that can have hooks attached to it, and this is the thing that the action is running that can actually execute these hooks. So Rails uses this in a bunch of places. It uses it in controllers. ActiveJob uses it. It's also used for ActiveRecord. There's a very similar defined method loop in ActiveRecord. And ActionCable also uses it. So it's used this metaprogramming to build up this generalizable piece of code that makes it very easy to add similar functionality throughout. This isn't even really something that is necessarily super developer facing, the internals of it. But it's a way in which Rails uses its metaprogramming to generalize its own actions that get used multiple times throughout the framework. The fourth piece that we're going to look at here is from the dirty module, ActiveRecord dirty. ActiveRecord dirty, active model dirty technically, I think, is the piece of code that holds on to values, the original values, when you change them. So there's an API here. If I have a zip code, for instance, if I have user.zip code and I set it, I can say, like, has the zip code changed, question mark, and it'll return true. I can say what was the old zip code with the zip code was. And there's about 5 or 6 methods here that are all attached to attribute names. And Rails knows to parse out these attribute names. So I'm talking about parsing out something dynamically based on the method name. That should sound like a method missing based on what we've already talked about. And in fact, it is, but it is in sort of an interesting, sort of indirected kind of way. So here's the actual piece of code from the dirty module that sets this up. So this is using a block called, it has an included method that is taking a block. And inside the block, we have all of these calls to methods called attribute method suffix, and then attribute method affix, which looks like it takes a prefix and a suffix, both of them. So we're defining underscore changed and underscore was, and then like restore attribute name, exclamation point, or clear attribute name change at the bottom. So here's how this works. Included is another piece of core Ruby. It belongs to module in Ruby, and it is automatically invoked. It takes a block that is automatically invoked whenever that module is included in another class or another module. It is typically used for sort of dynamic bookkeeping, live bookkeeping, when you don't know in advance where it's actually going to be used, but the details of where it's going to be used are important. So in this particular case, this is invoked as part of every individual ActiveRecord class in your code base, all of which have their own method names. So we need to sort of set this up for the attribute names of each individual ActiveRecord class. And inside this, we have all of these attribute method suffix things, and let's take a look at that just to get a sense of what that's doing. So every time this module is included, this method gets called. And the main point of this, the details of this are a little bit, I'm going to hand wave this a little bit. The main point here is it is creating some sort of pattern object. It's called here an attribute method pattern. And it is sort of holding on to that. So it is holding on to the idea that I need to pay attention to things that look like attribute names followed by this suffix, or attribute names that have this prefix and this suffix. And it is then sort of undefined attribute methods is like clearing a cache because we've created a new one, so we need to clear the existing cache. And then eventually, ActiveRecord has a method missing that parses this stuff dynamically. It actually doesn't do it in the method missing class. It has this matched attribute method that finds the pattern. It looks for the pattern match, and it looks for it in a specific way. What it will look for is if you have the pattern where, for example, the pattern is first name underscore was, it will find that pattern. We've defined that there's a pattern that has an attribute name, an underscore, and a suffix was, and it will look for an actual method defined named attribute underscore was and call it with that attribute name first name as the argument. So the contract here is if I say there's a pattern that behaves this way, I have defined a method that is sort of the template method of that pattern that uses the word attribute in the place of the attribute name and expects to have the actual attribute name as the first argument. So if you go into ActiveRecord dirty, you will see all of these attribute underscore things are defined. And so here's actually some of the definitions of it. Here's attribute was, attribute previously changed, which takes a couple of extra arguments. And it's doing its own bookkeeping here that is not, I'm not concerned necessarily right now with those internals. But that's what's happening here. The contract is that it is rewriting the method name to call this different method. Rails also uses this for question mark, attribute name question mark, which checks whether the attribute name has a value. And it also uses it for the equality setters. So this is a sort of very generalizable thing. If you wanted to do something where you wanted to be able to say like attribute underscore capitalize, where you would like automatically capitalize an attribute name, you could do that relatively easily with this sort of suffix mechanism. You would just need to call that attribute method suffix thing, and it would and then define attribute capitalize, and you could get it to work for you. Whether this is like a good idea or not, I'm not sure. I will say that there's a long-standing design aesthetic of Active Record that it does not want you to look up attribute name, not want you to use attribute names as symbols. It really wants you to treat attributes as methods. So this seems to me to be sort of a piece with that as a design decision. We don't want to have to use the attribute name as a symbol. We want to have a method name based on it. It's very consistent with the way Active Record works in other features. The last thing I want to talk about here is migrations, a piece of the migration code. So originally, in the earliest version of Rails, when you defined a migration, you had to separately specify the up migration, which was the migration going forward, and the down migration, which was the rollback. You had to explicitly specify both of them, which I think is pretty clear, leads to the opportunity of fairly subtle bugs if you don't get them to exactly mirror each other, or if you do things in the wrong order. It's a pretty common pain point in the earlier days of Rails. And eventually, Rails came up with a mechanism of you define a method called change that defines the up method, and Rails infers the down method. And I'm going to show all of that code base, but I'm going to show a piece of that code base here. Again, I apologize, this is a little bit small. But this is from the migrations file. And what it's doing here is we have a key value table here. It could be a two-dimensional array. I don't know why it's not. But it is set up as a key value table here, where the key is a method name and the value is a method name that implements the inverse method. So you have, for example, create table tied to drop table. You have add index tied to remove index, and so on. And then we loop over all of those key value pairs, and we double loop because we loop over them both ways. So you see that line that says inverse command followed by command inverse. Each do. So it's looping through this both directions. It's both creating drop table as the inverse of create table, and it is creating create table as the inverse of drop table. And what it's doing here, and actually this is the most similar to what Eileen showed this morning, is using this method called class eval in Ruby. Class eval takes a string, and it evaluates that string in the context of the class of the current object. So it's creating a class method. The string here, we're using a Ruby here doc to create the string, and we're using string interpolation to dynamically build out the name of the string and the body of the string. There is a helpful comment here that shows what a sample one looks like. So we're creating a method called invert create table that returns a data structure that Rails will use to determine what to do when you invert a create table. Simultaneously, in the same loop, it will do inverse drop table, which will have a data structure that will return create table as the first element of it. The other thing that's interesting to call attention to is that the class eval takes extra arguments, the under _file and under _line. These are sort of magic global variables in Ruby. Under _file returns the name of the current file. Under _line returns the current line number that you're executing. And what this does is it ties the new method definition. It says if anybody ever asks what line this method was defined at, tell them that it was defined in this file and this line +1, because it's actually the line where it's actually defining the method. And you can use that information to trace these method names back to this file in this location. So this makes reversible migrations very easy. So we've now looked at 5 things that five ways that Rails uses metaprogramming to take complexity on in the Rails framework so that you, the developer, don't have to deal with some of the complexity. And so one thing to talk about here at the end is like, why is Rails like this? Why does it do these things? And one thing that people who are skeptical of these kinds of toolings often bring up is discoverability. And what that means typically is that because these methods are not defined explicitly, so the production question mark is not defined explicitly, before action is not defined explicitly, like almost everything that we've talked about here is defined dynamically at runtime. Because they're not defined because they're not in the file explicitly defined, the lookup definition ID button just doesn't work. Like if you're used to a static environment and you're used to pressing Control B or F12 or however you have it keyed up to take you to the method definition, it doesn't work. And I don't want to minimize that. I used RubyMine. RubyMine has very robust lookup definition functionality for Ruby. I use it frequently. It has some limitations, obviously, but it's definitely a valuable tool. I don't want to minimize the loss of that tool, but I want to also suggest that not having that tool is not necessarily a reason to bottleneck using these techniques. And one of the reasons for that, I think that one of the things that happens here is that people who come to Ruby from more static languages expect to be able to use the tools of a static language to parse Ruby, a very dynamic language. And what I think is also true, it is definitely true that static tools are not enough to parse Ruby for this kind of discoverability. However, Ruby also has dynamic tools that allow you to dynamically do this kind of discovery, and they don't tie into the IDE as easily. And I don't want to minimize the fact that they're a little bit more complicated to use, but they are there. Eileen mentioned this also this morning. Source location works for both classes and instances, and you pass it a method object. This is before action, application controller method before action. You parse it, you do it the source location. You can do this in a print statement in your code. You can do it in pry. There's other ways to look up method source location in pry. And it will tell you where the method is defined and what line it was defined at. If it is defined in a defined method or class eval, it will point you to that line. If it is a method missing, I believe it will take you to the method missing, to the definition of the method missing that is invoked. So you can then look there and get a better idea what's going on. Is that the same as pressing S12 and having the editor pop up directly to the method as it's defined? No. But can you use this relatively quickly to find out what's going on? Yes, you can. And I note that the person that was complaining about the string Inquirer on Mastodon posted like 20 minutes later that he'd figured it out. He also said nobody ever used this, ever. But he did find it. And while, again, 20 minutes is not the same as 30 seconds, it's also like a finite, manageable amount of time. So that's my play here. Another sort of common feature of many of these interfaces is they are designed not to be thought of by the end developer, not to worry about how the @ symbols get from one place to another, not to worry about how the callbacks are defined, not to worry about how the migrations work. They're provided with robust APIs that have decent documentation, and therefore, in most cases, you don't have the answer to the discovery problem is don't worry about it. Which, again, I don't want to minimize the fact that some of us really do want to worry about it. We want to know how these things work, and that's not nothing. But I do think that only thinking of that transaction in terms of the developer costs and not in terms of the developer benefit is really a loss. It causes you to discard a lot of useful Ruby techniques. Okay. And these techniques, they make Rails flexible. They make it really easy to add things like the dirty behavior in Rails. If you wanted to do weird stuff with attribute names in Rails, it's really easy to do. It's generalizable. Rails has generalized out this mechanism for doing callbacks that you can actually use. The controller stuff puts another layer on top of it. You could do that too. You don't have to. You can use it directly. And that's great. And it's all in the name of creating a developer experience that is where the amount of boilerplate code you need to write is reduced, and the amount of power that you have to build things is increased. So I think like a lot of these mechanisms are somewhat more suited for library code that has to be generalized. But I think every organization has common code, common functionality, where these mechanisms might be valuable, where you can take complexity into your centralized library or whatever, and use these sort of metaprogramming techniques to create more flexible APIs for the developers within your organization to use it. Ruby metaprogramming works great where you have a number of very similar functionalities that differ only on some piece of data, like the name of a symbol or something like that. You almost certainly have some place in your code base where you can do something like that. I use a lot of these methods. I use string Inquirer probably too much in my own code, not in code that I make other people look at, but in my own code. And I think I encourage you to try to explore these techniques within your own code base, because I think you will find them to be, like you're at a Ruby conference. Hopefully you'll find those techniques to be fun and useful. So with that, I have reached the end of what I have to say. We can come back to the self-promotional portion of our afternoon. To my surprise and somewhat your surprise, I'm currently the co-author of the new version of Programming Ruby, the Pickaxe book. Thank you. I desperately wanted to come here and tell you that it was draft complete and that a full complete beta would be out. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you that. I'm basically like one COVID diagnosis short of getting it out. Hopefully, it will be draft complete by, hopefully there'll be a draft complete beta out by mid-May, 2 weeks or so. And then it needs to go through the whole production process. The physical book is pre-orderable on Amazon. It's going to be a while before that. You should also hit me up if you're interested in being a reviewer of the full text. Contact me, direct message me, something like that. So that's the URL where you can get that at. So 30% off code with RailsConf Atlanta. That is good through May 5th, I am told. And you can find me online at Noel Rapp at Ruby Social, mostly. I'm technically still on Twitter. You can DM me there, but I don't post there very much these days. And you can also find me at noelrappin.com, where you can sign up for a newsletter that has been dormant for the last 18 months while I have been working on the Pickaxe book. But hopefully this summer it will fire back up as that book moves out of my hands and into other people's hands. Thank you very much. I hope you found this worth your time. I certainly appreciate the time you've chosen to spend with me here, and I hope you enjoy the next couple days of your conference, and really thank you for being a part of this community and coming here today.